This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. In recent weeks, Israel has bombed Syria, Yemen, Lebanon. Its military has been killing in the West Bank and, of course, has unleashed unimaginable horrors in Gaza. The International Criminal Court has sought arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former defense minister, while Israeli soldiers are being pursued in Brazil and elsewhere. Yet Canada continues to arm Israel, both directly and indirectly. Today, we are going to discuss Canada's arms sales to Israel, government deception on the matter, and the campaign to oppose these arms deliveries. To discuss the subject, we have with us Rachel Small, who is the Canadian organizer for World Beyond War and an activist with Jews Say No to Genocide. First of all, Rachel, thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And can you just start off maybe by just talking about sort of what we know about the amount of arms sales that's gone to Israel in recent years, recent months?
Thanks for having me. So the first thing we have to say when we talk about numbers is that we don't have the numbers. And the whole reason that one reason this issue has been really hard to organize around is that the data on the Canada-Israel arms trade, or frankly on the Canadian military trade in general, is there's no transparency. It is very much kept under wraps. Everything is secretive. There are tiny bits of information that the government does release every year, but it's barely the tip of the iceberg. So I want to say that just because when people do see numbers, the little numbers that we do have available to us, for example, we know that 2023, the new record was set in terms of Canadian military exports to Israel. It was just over $30 million worth of goods shipped. That is not the total figure of the Canadian weapons that are shipped to Israel. That is the very small amount that went through the permitting process through Global Affairs Canada to ship directly from Canada to Israel, and were directly subject to be classified as military goods in a very strict, particular way. So, just to say, we get snapshots of numbers every year that Global Affairs Canada releases showing how much Canada has exported militarily from Canada to any number of countries around the world, but it really doesn't tell the full picture by any means. Nonetheless, we know, yes, that in terms of those direct exports, so goods that were made in Canada and then exported directly to Israel, we know 2023 was a record-setting year. We will have to see the total figures from 2024 when they come out as well. We know there have been many hundreds of active permits that have been approved. We don't have the exact numbers on which ones have been used and which ones haven't been used. And I think more relevantly, we know that a vastly superior amount of weapons are going from Canada to Israel via the US, and we don't have the figures or the stats for that at all, but we know that it blows the 30 million out of the water.
And so there's all kinds of sort of deception and word games that have been played by government officials on this matter. You sort of alluded to some of that. The Canadian government says it hasn't okayed any new permits since January 8th of last year, so 1 year ago. Now, what does that actually mean? There were outstanding permits. Is this just deception? Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah. So, the first thing I want to say is I'm next going to talk about how this isn't as much of a win as we might have hoped it would be. But I do first want to say that even that kind of a stance, from my perspective, would have been unimaginable a few years ago. Like for Canada, a NATO member, one of Israel's staunchest allies, to say, we're not going to approve any new weapons permits to export to Israel, that was a huge slap in the face to Israel. And if you looked at the Israeli media headlines in the week that followed, if you looked at Netanyahu's tweets about it, they were livid. So that mattered, and that was a unprecedented, at least in my knowledge over the past few decades, stance for Canada to take. And they did it being kind of dragged kicking and screaming the whole way because of what I would also say was an unprecedented rising up of resistance all across Canada, demanding that the bare minimum Canada needs to do right now is stop sending weapons to Israel. There's so much more we need to do, but that is just beyond inexcusable. So the government's response, as you mentioned, was to say, okay, we're not going to approve any more weapons permits. It was deeply I think that was true. I think at its face, I think those words are true. I believe that it is true that they have not approved new weapons permits for that since then. What they did not say at the time, and props to Alex Kosh at the Maple, who made this abundantly clear when they government wouldn't, is that sure, they stopped approving permits as of January 8th, but they had just approved in October, November, December a record-breaking number of permits for exports to Israel. And they didn't cancel those permits. So basically, they stamped tons of papers saying, yes, 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 you can approve to Israel October, November, December, the first few months of this round of genocide. And then in January, they said, oh, we're not going to approve any more permits. But of course, all the existing permits keep using those to ship weapons to Israel. So that was what was kind of really going on there. And then there's been kind of a few other, maybe let's say incremental wins since then as well. So in early September now, a few months ago, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly announced that the Canadian government had done. So we've been calling for them to not just stop issuing permits, but cancel all the permits, like actually stop the flow of all weapons to Israel. In September, she announced they had suspended 30 of the existing active permits. They wouldn't tell us which ones. We have no clue how significant those 30 permits were or weren't. But that was suspending some of the permits that were continuing to be used to ship arms to Israel. Of course, what she didn't say is that there are at least 200 export permits that continue to be valid. So suspending 30 is roughly, for like, back of the napkin math, about 12% of the existing active export permits. It's something, but it's far from what we're demanding for. And I mean, what she also said in that, speaking to your point about kind of uh, is what is happening here in terms of government deception. What she said in that same statement in September, we will not have any form of arms or parts of arms be sent to Gaza, period. And then she said how they're being sent and where they're being sent is irrelevant, which is on one hand affirming to hear her echo what we've been saying, which is stop the flow no matter how they get there. But unfortunately, she did nothing to address the fact that the majority of weapons travel there via the US. All of this talk of canceling permits, suspending permits, that only touches on the weapons that go straight from Canada to Israel. That doesn't touch on the majority that go first to the US. The only weapons shipment relating to this transfer through the US that they've taken action to address was the one that we made a huge stink about, us and many, many allies across the country, when it was sort of accidentally revealed that a General Dynamics factory in Quebec would be making explosives for export via the US to Israel. When that came to light, and when people, yeah, just had a huge public outcry about that, they committed to blocking that shipment as well. But we know that the vast majority, like I've mentioned, of these Canadian arms exports to Israel are continuing to flow to there via the US, and they're not tracked, they're not reported, they're certainly not even requiring a permit. And I
And
should also just maybe mention that the side of this that doesn't often get talked about, we were talking about that October, November, December, when they approved a record-breaking number of arms exports. But in that same time frame, in December 2023, Minister Blair, the defense minister, the war minister, also announced a new deal to purchase millions of dollars of Israeli weapons. In this case, the Spike LR2 missiles. So those are made by Rafael, which is an Israeli state-owned industry. And I mean, this is really significant because, I mean, Israel has just said straight up that one of their main strategies for funding their genocide is the sale of these weapons tested on Palestinians, battle tested this year. And I mean, so I think it's really clear and important to highlight both sides of the demand for an arms embargo, that at the same time that Canada is selling weapons to Israel, it's also directly funding the Israeli war machine by buying their weapons.
on the issue of government deception on this is interesting because there's a whole history to this. Back in 1948, Canada had a it wasn't allowed to send weapons to Israel during the Nakba, but the Canadian government actually came up with all kinds of different ways of getting permits. So they actually came up with the idea of creating a Tel Aviv Spring Fair to justify exporting single-engine Harvard trainer monoplanes that were easily convertible to military uses. And then after Israel was created in the 50s. early 50s, they were sending, Canada was sending weapons to Israel, selling weapons to Israel regularly. And it was kind of done and very quietly. And the actual Americans were pressing Canada because they didn't want to be sending the weapons directly to Israel on their own, wanted Canada to send these F-86 fighter jets to Israel. So this is a long history of sort of backroom kind of games and lack of public information on this issue because of course arms sales is a controversial issue. But you talked a bit about the weapons going through the U.S. and that is obviously the most important way, and we don't know the quantities of these weapon sales going through the U.S. But that brings up this question, actually kind of a fundamental question to Canadian foreign policy, certainly Canadian defense policy, which is this defense production sharing arrangement that goes back all the way to 1956 that Canada has with the US. Can you talk a little bit about the defense production sharing arrangement and how weapons, Canadian companies are basically treated as American companies when it comes to weapons sales to the Pentagon and how this fits into weapons going to Israel?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm certainly not an expert on this agreement. I think probably most of what I do know probably comes via Project Plowshares, and they're like really excellent research constantly on the Canadian arms trade. But I mean, my understanding is that in effect, it creates this sort of reciprocal arrangement. And this is described like on the Global Affairs Canada website. This is not a secret, this part that lets there be this free movement of most military goods, the vast majority between Canada and the US, as we mentioned, like without needing a permit, without needing any kind of license. And when Canada signed the Arms Trade Treaty, which was a global initiative to, yeah, limit the flow of weapons in contexts where they were going to be used to commit blatant abuses of human rights, war crimes, etc. Canada was quite clear at that point that yes, we are joining the arms trade treaty, but we're going to be very careful to not harm our incredibly valuable military trade relationship with the US. So as World Beyond War, we spent a lot of the past year trying to map out the Canada-Israel arms trade and specifically look at where are these factories all across the country that are physically producing these goods for a bunch of reasons, because it's important to know, but also there's ways in which you can take action and directly interrupt the flow of weapons if you actually have detailed information about who is making these weapons and what workers and what goods and what transport companies and are they on the rails, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that really, yeah, did stand out for me in that process was just how many US military giants facilities there are within Canada that, yes, are essentially shuttling goods, it seems, back and forth across the border as though the border doesn't exist. And that there are a huge number of Canadian facilities that are making key components of, yeah, the largest weapon systems on Earth. And I mean, we only know a fraction of this. This is like very classified information, the details on these weapons programs and who's making which parts, etc. in general. But we know lots of the broad strokes. And in some cases, we know the information because these same weapons companies, when they're trying to sell the Canadian military these weapon systems, for example, when Lockheed Martin was trying to get Canada to purchase its F-35 as its next fighter jet, which Canada has indeed committed to do, the way they sold it to the Canadian government and presumably the public was by bragging about how many of the parts for the existing F-35 program were already being made in Canada. So in that case, we have Lockheed Martin telling us, well, in fact, look at all these Canadian factories that are making vital components of every single F-35 jet. We know the same thing, for example, with Boeing Apache helicopters, that every single one has a huge number of Canadian components. So what that means is every time you see, and these are two of the key weapons of war that are bombing Gaza right now, that are bombing Lebanon. And every single one of them has we don't know exactly how many, but millions of dollars at least in Canadian components. So it's just one kind of little glimpse into the ways in which, as you said, there are both Canadian companies and branches of US companies all across so-called Canada that are making critical components of the weapons of war that are committing, yeah, just the worst atrocities on the planet.
And you touched on the F-35. There's been some stories. I believe there's some campaigning maybe in Belgium on this whole question of the sole source supplier for the F-35. And basically, the idea being a company that provides a part, it's the only company that provides that part to the F-35. And therefore, if you're able to sort of disrupt that company's production of that part, you potentially could disrupt the whole assembly of these devastating fighter jets. And so the Breach did a story where they talked about this Ottawa firm Gas Stop. I think it's Gas Stop. That's as far as we know, the only sole source supplier in Canada for the F-35. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I understand there's been a bit of protest in Ottawa at this company's facilities, and yeah, anything more on that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's well over 100 Canadian suppliers who've been awarded contracts for the F-35 program. So there are tons of these companies. Um, it's hard sometimes to get the information about which one might be a sole source supplier. And frankly, if I was Lockheed Martin, I wouldn't necessarily be giving away tons of that information because it would appear to be a vulnerability. But in this case, yes, the breach did some excellent reporting and discovered that apparently gas tops in Canada, especially based in Ottawa, though they have a few other facilities, is apparently the only place in the world that makes the particular type of engine sensor that every single F-35 uses. So that's vital. I mean, the Ottawa facility, like we're talking about probably 2 to 3 dozen people max who make this part. So it's an incredible, I would say, vulnerability in the F-35 supply chain. But digging more into this, we've also discovered I shouldn't say discovered. We've sort of uncovered or tried to piece together the picture around some other really key suppliers in Canada. So, for example, ASCO is a company in Delta, BC, sort of outside of Vancouver, and they make the largest single piece of every single F-35. It's like the wing bulkhead, like sort of a big sort of, I'm not an aviation person, a big metal component on the outside of the plane is the bulkhead. And they, based on sort of the numbers we crunched, seem to make the vast majority of them for all F-35s, based on looking at ASCO's numbers, at the numbers of F-35 buckets they've shipped, versus Lockheed Martin's numbers on the total number of F-35s that have been produced. Similarly, AeroDevTech in Quebec is a key F-35 producer and supplier between their Laval factory and their Longueuil factory seem to make the vast majority of some of the key components of every single F-35. So yeah, Canada's a major player, and there's a few factories certainly that make, yeah, critical components that either are majority made in Canada or are exclusively made here. And as you mentioned, people in Ottawa does not escape their notice that they have an important factory right in their city. There's been a whole bunch of different protests there. A couple months ago, there was an anonymous submission of a sabotage action that had happened at gas tops as well, where a whole bunch of I don't have the details, but they reported different types of equipment that had been damaged, and the factory was observed to have been closed and shuttered for at least several days afterwards. Um, so it seems like people are increasingly taking notice of these facilities, and I should say, and some of these World Beyond War has been involved in, some of them we haven't in terms of other types of large-scale blockades, factory shutdowns. World Beyond War has been part of several where we've shut down an entire shift of a factory that makes parts either for F-35s or other weaponry that Israel is using. Where people, yeah, have come together and simply have not allowed people to come into work that day. So there's been lots of different types of actions. There's lots of folks who are trying to connect around unions and workers and work from the inside on this. One thing that to me has been interesting recently, digging more into the F-35 question, is that I've been stumbling on some recent documentation lately highlighting just how much maintenance Israel's fleet of F-35s requires right now, in part because the way that they are flying them, like they're just constantly keeping them in the air, very, very short distance flights and just constant bombing missions, has resulted in them just constantly needing shipments of replacement parts from partner nations. The reason I'm highlighting this is that when we've been bringing this issue to MPs, to the Canadian government, they sort of say, oh, well, even if we interrupted the F-35 supply chain, like that wouldn't affect anything for a decade to come. These planes take many, many years to build, when what I'm increasingly seeing is that that's not true, and Canadian companies are sending replacement parts right now for the F-35s that are currently in the air over Palestine. So I think that there's a much more dynamic relationship. Not so much Canada ships these parts and 10 years later they end up in a jet.
And so I guess maybe just to conclude, now there's clearly been some success as you've highlighted on this issue of the, get forcing the government to at least stop new permits. There's a certain degree of, and also that big arms sale that was for the through the U.S. That Jolie said she was going to stop. So there's been some success. It's an issue that I think a lot of people kind of just intuitively don't, like we shouldn't be giving weapons to killing babies in Gaza. That's not that complicated of an argument to be made. How do people, plug in? What's the where, more about this sort of activism and how people can plug into to campaign on this issue if they're so interested?
Yeah, I have been just really impressed with the ways that people, I mean, frankly, have just showed up in solidarity with Palestine in many, many different ways over the past year and a half. But specifically around the campaign for an arms embargo, I think, like you said, it's really resonated with people at a very basic and tangible level. But also, I think people starting to understand, like, oh, right, in my community, like in many cases, like 200 meters from my house, like in my backyard, is this weapons factory that I never knew was there. This is something tangible that I can do here that has an impact on what's happening on the other side of the world. So, I mean, I'm always encouraging people towards direct actions, towards doing kind of the most impactful thing that people can do in their local community. But I mean, back in May, we got together with a few other organizations to launch the Arms Embargo Now campaign, which has really taken off. I think we've now got about 400 organizations who are signatories. We've got 40 something MPs who I just don't have the number in front of me, who have, I think 47 maybe, who have formally endorsed it and said, yes, I'm calling for an arms embargo, including 20 something Liberal MPs. None of that includes the Bloc, who have not signed on with individual MPs, but have issued their own letter of support calling for an arms embargo. All that to say that from the MP level to the grassroots level to some of the largest unions, the United Church, like some of the largest institutions in the country have now signed on to this demand for a full two-way arms embargo on Israel, which, as I mentioned, is not just about ending the sale of weapons to Israel, but also the purchase of weapons from Israel, because really it's the same thing in terms of supporting the war industry and what Israel is doing. Um, the ways to plug into that are everything from trying to get your MP to sign on. And those 40 something MPs that have signed on, very few were initially on board. Many of them became on board once their constituents kept showing that up, whether that was like bird dogging at their holiday party and that sort of thing, or just constantly organizing meetings, holding big protests, making it clear like that this was a priority. I mean, I would highlight that, yeah, again, this demand is sort of the very first sanction that Canada should put on Israel. And if you go to Global Affairs Canada and look at the sanctions webpage, it defines an arms embargo. And we haven't made up some radical new demand. This is something that Global Affairs Canada itself understands to be a sanction and one they've placed on other countries in the past. So this is only the first sanction that, or one of the first sanctions that Canada should place on Israel. Cutting off the flow of weapons is again the bare absolute minimum. And so I'm always encouraging people to join all of the other campaigns that folks are running to cut off the flow of financial support from Canada to Israel, to look at the diplomatic support, the ways Canada is voting at the UN, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, armsembargonow.ca is a great place to plug in, and World Beyond War is maintaining and constantly building a map and directory of the companies all across Canada that are involved in arming Israel, with all the factory locations, etc., across the country, and that's at worldbeyondwar.org/Canada Stop Arming Israel.
People make sure to check out World Beyond Wars and me get on World Beyond Wars email list as well. Probably a good idea, place to start. Thanks a lot for coming on, talking foreign policy, Rachel, and we'll keep following this issue.
Thanks for having me.